And we are going to get down on it at within Crisis in the Colonies. This video lesson is all about the events that Britain did in conjunction with the colonies in their relationship that led to the colonies being very frustrated with British actions and eventually declaring their independence. As you see behind me, I have a teapot. As we know, in Britain, they drank a lot of tea. That continued in the colonies. So we always go over this, but to boil tea, obviously put the tea, sometimes in a tea bag, whatever, in the water, but you have to turn up the heat, boils it, makes the tea. Well, in this case, the heat is going to be all of the actions that Britain does against the colonies, and it's not just going to make great tea, it's going to boil over and burn everybody. So let's start looking at this and going over what we need to go over here. Okay, so taxes, consent, and protest is going to focus on what the British did. Okay, and as you can see, the first two things. So the recap of the French Indian War, remember that the French had the Orange area, they lost all of their land. This is going to lead the British to having a lot more opportunities and like the fur trade and one less enemy to worry about. But as we know, even though they gain this land, they get a lot of debt from the French and Indian War, and that debt must be paid in some way, shape, or form. Also, the colonists can go west because the French are no longer there, but that leads to problems. The king has to create the Proclamation Line of 1763 because settlers were moving west of the Appalachians, getting into conflicts with Native Americans, and it was costing even more money after the war. So what the king did is he said, you're going to pay for pretty much your babysitters. We're going to tax you. You're going to be paid, have to pay for these 10,000 troops to come in and defend this line along the Appalachian Mountains and make sure you're not going west and causing problems. The colonists are angry because they're losing money, they're losing opportunity to move, and they're being told what to do, which they really haven't been told too much of what to do at this point. And it's been over 100 years for some settlements. As it says, they're going to ignore this proclamation and still go west. So we need to remember that the colonists are subjects of Britain. They are citizens there under the British flag, and they must follow the rules and laws that King George III and Parliament create. As it says below, colonies established in the New World were controlled by, well, the aristocracies, the new established represent governments, and those monarchs. So there was a lot of government officials, but it always came down to the king. Okay, one such series of acts that made the colonies very upset was the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were laws that made mercantilism the law. Mercantilism itself is just a concept where the colony must benefit the homeland. But with these Navigation Acts, it became official. Navigation Acts made it illegal to sell almost anything to another country than England. And this was primarily the case with cash crops. So you might be able to sell your crop to France for more money, but you're not allowed. You have to sell it to England. That's going to get a lot of people frustrated. As it says, these acts included taxes on goods. So it's not even just that you have to send it to England, but you might be taxed on it as well, where once again, France might be willing to pay more money and have no tax. Now, that may not have been the case, but that could have happened, and that's where the colonies are going to be upset with these restrictions. And as you can see, that kind of explains and brings triangle trade back into what we've been talking about. So another area that the colonies were very upset about was the legal system. And this is where there were many differences between what happened to citizens in England and citizens in the colonies. In the colonies, in some cases, there were no juries on some of the courts for certain decisions. Juries are a group of people, picked citizens, that determine guilt. If you didn't have a jury, you had a judge, one person deciding on it. Now, a lot of times those judges might be sympathetic or side with the British government in these cases. So he really had a system set up that hurt the colonists, whereas in Britain, they had, in any case that they didn't have juries, in the colonies, they did have juries in England. So that doesn't seem very fair. Also, when it came to smuggling cases, in England, you were considered innocent and you had to prove your guilt. In the colonies, they just assumed that you were guilty and you had to prove your innocence. So imagine if I said that you stole my car. You have to prove that you didn't. Now, unless you have a camera on you 24/7 or somebody's watching you every single moment, you can't necessarily prove that. It's much harder to prove that you're innocent as opposed to someone else proving that you're guilty. And that's why in America today, you are innocent until proven guilty. Someone must prove that you committed the crime. So the big thing that it came down to was taxes. Now, this is a big concept that we usually get mixed up on. It wasn't about the money. Let's get through this. Remember, Britain is in debt because of the French Indian War. The colonies are not supposed to cost England, they're supposed to make England money. So what Parliament is going to do is begin taxing the colonies. So some of the first taxes are the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. Sugar Act is a direct tax on sugar, on molasses. The Stamp Act, tax on things like wills, what you need to give things to people when you pass away. Marriage papers, newspapers, playing cards, you'd get a stamp. This was a sales tax. Okay, when you go to the store and buy the PlayStation 400 or the Xbox 373, I don't know. If it says it costs $499, there's going to be a tax involved. So it might be $536 or something like that. This is the first version of this. Now, the colonies had paid taxes since they got there, but they had been passed by their own government. So this was a surprise to have the king start taxing them. So how did the colonies respond? With this phrase, no taxation without representation. The colonists did not feel they should be able, that Britain should be able to tax them without their consent. What does that mean? That means that the colonists wanted a say. They weren't saying that they wouldn't agree to pay to it, but they wanted to be involved in the decision making. They'd been involved in decision making in the colonies since the Mayflower Compact, but now their decision making was being taken away from them. They wanted representation in England, in Parliament, just like their fellow citizens had. The colonists, as we said, had been used to this. Our examples are our legislatures and our town meetings. So yes, okay, nobody wants to pay taxes. Nobody wants to put in more money than they have to. But it really was about the voice, having your input into these decisions. Once again, the British reaction, we paid for your protection, you got to benefit us in some way, shape, or form. We don't really care whether you had a voice in this. I mean, before Parliament got involved, it was the king just making every decision anyway. So you just got to roll with it. Colonial, no one asked us, no direct representation. And this is going to have the colonies reacting in a way that no other colonies had reacted at this point in history.